Greetings. We've reached chapter 14 in This Freedom Whence, John Wesley, Bready. Parallel creative victories. Parallel to, of course, the abolition of slavery, which was the substance of the last chapter. Parallel creative victories. This is a quote from George M. Trevelyan, History of England. The anti-slave trade movement was the first successful propagandist agitation of the modern type, and its methods were afterwards imitated by the myriad societies and leagues, political, religious, philanthropic, and cultural, which characterized 19th century England. Bready begins the chapter this way: as long as the slave trade and slavery were permitted to flourish and expand, so long all efforts for social reform in other spheres were doomed to abortiveness. Wesley had not overstated the case when he pronounced slavery, quote, the execrable sum of all the villainies, unquote. By reducing men and women to marketable chattels, it cheapened all human life. By its forced labor under the lash, it vulgarized and degraded all labor. By offering fortunes to the unscrupulous, it contaminated all economic relationships. By its monopoly, purchase of rotten boroughs, it multiplied political corruption. By its crucifixion of the basic decencies of civilized society, it poisoned the milk of human kindness and dehumanized human nature. This degradation by Christian peoples of millions of their fellow humans had a baneful reflex on every aspect of the social structure. To strive, therefore, for any measure of creative reform while leaving the slave trade and slavery to mock at all the sanctities of a Christian society was to beat the air. Slavery affected the social problem in its totality, per totum. So manifold and subtle were its impacts that nothing save a regenerated social conscience could challenge its domain. And the regenerated conscience waited upon the baptism of fire which gave it birth. But when once the spiritual renewal had come, and slavery began to be adjudged the diabolical perversion it was, then the marks of the lesser thraldoms it bred or fed were seen in perspective, and man, independent of color, race, or tongue, being now recognized as an immortal soul, the humanitarian cause began gradually to advance on many fronts. This subhead is the humanizing of the prison system. Edmund Burke, in his noble Guildhall speech, exposing certain injustices of the penal code, paid memorable tribute to the unique endeavors of John Howard. This is a direct quote from Burke. I cannot name this gentleman without remarking that his labors and writings have done much to open the eyes and hearts of mankind. He has visited all Europe, not to survey the sumptuousness of palaces or the stateliness of temples, not to make accurate measurements of the remains of ancient grandeur, nor to form a scale of the curiosity of modern art, nor not to collect medals or collate manuscripts, but to dive into the depths of dungeons, to plunge into the infection of hospitals, to survey the mansions of sorrow and pain, to take the gauge and dimensions of misery, depression, and contempt, to remember the forgotten, to attend to the neglected, to visit the forsaken, and to compare and collate the distresses of all men in all countries. His plan is original, and it is as full of genius as it is of humanity. It was a voyage of discovery, a circumnavigation of charity. Already, the benefit of his labor is felt more or less in every country. End of quote. John Howard was among the most heroic of the 18th century products of the revival. In his evangelicalism, as in the case of Wilberforce and many other vital characters, the influence of dissent, Methodism, and Anglicanism coalesced. Born in a pious, independent home, that is, a dissenting home, he continued a nonconformist, but he had no enthusiasm either for denominationalism or dissent as such. He was a zealous disciple of Wesley and a warm supporter of the revival. Yet married twice, both his wives, to whom he was in turn devoted, were churchwomen, and though a dissenter till death, Howard revered all true Christianity, Protestant or Catholic, and so great was his appeal to the soul of the British people That was the first statue admitted to St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was raised by public subscription. In reminiscent vein, Howard once made known to a group of Wesley's preachers the challenge and inspiration he had derived from a sermon preached by Wesley at his seat in Bedfordshire on the text, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might." After an interview with Wesley in Dublin, he related to Alexander Knox how sustaining he found the fellowship of his great friend. About to set off on one of his prolonged tours of prison inspection, he called on Wesley to present him with an inscribed copy of his famous book and to say goodbye. It was a profound disappointment to him to learn that the evangelist had left London en route for Ireland, not long before he arrived at his rooms. Wesley's admiration for Howard was equally keen. Following an extended conversation with him in 1787, he expressed the belief that the prison reformer was one of the greatest men in Europe. Howard's immediate precursors, as friends of the debtor, the felon, and the murderer in their enforced haunts of wretchedness, were of spiritual outlook much akin to his own, as during the years of the persecuting code, hundreds of Quakers and other Puritans died in vile jails. The nonconformists naturally developed a sympathetic interest in the welfare of prisoners. But under the blighting conditions of the early 18th century, that interest waned. Wesley, too, as we have seen, was a constant friend of prisoners. Newgate, London, he considered the nearest possible earthly approach to hell. Newgate was the big prison in London. He raised money to procure clothing and blankets for the French prisoners of the 7 Years' War, detained in English jails. And he encouraged all his preachers, when permitted to do so, to visit and minister to prisoners. Charles Wesley expended much gracious effort upon prisoners. Silas Todd, one of Wesley's most heroic teachers and preachers, served them faithfully all his life. And Mr. Dagge, who transformed the face of the Bristol Newgate years before Howard began his life work, was one of the earliest products of the revival, converted under George Whitefield. More about John Howard and the prison ministry next time. I'll put in a link to something about Charles Wesley, who was not only a great minister, but brother of John, of course, but was one of the greatest hymn writers in all history, maybe the greatest. So a video Vivian did from Victor Shepard's tribute to Charles Wesley.